What's up everyone, and welcome back to Operation Overhaul. Today we have an '08 Jeep Wrangler that needs axle bearings and seals, and as you can see, it's a windy day, so I'll be doing a voiceover for the video. I start off by removing the drain plug with a 3/8 ratchet. I use a 3-inch extension to gain better access to the plug, and then once it's loosened, I use the extension to finish removing the plug from the rear end. And as you can see from the video, this Jeep does have higher mileage and there is a good bit of metal on the magnetic plug. While the fluid is draining, it is a good idea to go ahead and remove all the cover bolts on it. I used a 13mm to do this and also an impact driver, as the bolts do not have a lot of torque to them. There is one bolt behind the panhard bar though that you will need to use a wrench to access. This is a little bit too close for a swivel as well, so a wrench is needed on this area. Also, I left one bolt in the top. The last bolt holding the cover in place. I used something thin like a screwdriver or a scraper to pry the cover away. Be sure not to damage the cover as it is thin and can be bent easily. Also, make sure you have a drain pan underneath the differential to catch any residual fluids that are left in there. While holding the cover, I remove the last bolt, and once I remove it, I inspect the differential and the cover to be sure that there are no broken pieces or loose particles inside of the differential. Here I am removing the brake system on the driver's side, and you need to remove the rotors, the calipers, and the brackets to gain access to the axle bolts. To do this, I use an 18mm wrench rather than a ratchet, as there's limited space on the bottom bolt. Here you can see how much space I actually have to work with, and I use a little bit longer wrench as it gives me more leverage, as the bolts tend to have Loctite on them that hold the caliper brackets on. No one likes to watch anyone remove the bolts completely, so I sped this part of the video up for you so you didn't have to watch that. But once I did remove the caliper bracket bolts, I used a zip tie and hung the caliper up so it wasn't pulling on the brake hose. You do need to remove the wheel speed sensor, and to do this, it's just a single 18mm bolt and a wire connector. Before removing the axle, you must remove these 4 nuts that hold the axle and the backing plate on. These are 18mm as well, and as you can see, I use a wrench to take these off as it is limited space. Once you remove the 4 nuts, climb back underneath the Jeep and use a flat blade screwdriver or a pry bar and pry between the cross shaft and the axle shaft to free it from the spider gear on the side. Once the axle is free, go back to the side and pull the axle out of the housing slowly to ensure that you do not damage the splines. Once the axle is free, leave the backing plate in place, and then you can remove the bearing races. Now comes the fun part of getting the spacer off of the axle. To do this, I use a cutoff wheel on a die grinder. I cut about 90% through the spacer, just enough not to nick the axle. Once I get about 90% through, I use a chisel and a hammer, and I hit it directly on the cut line. It should break the spacer just enough to where you can knock it off the axle without having to press it off. Now that the spacer is removed, repeat the process on the bearing itself. First remove the cage and the bearings and then cut through the bottom race. Now that everything is cut off, it's time to put it all back together. Make sure you put the seal, then the bearing, then the spacer. I start everything on the axle with a piece of wood to ensure that it's all straight. Once I got it down as far as I can, I go and get a metal spacer to put onto the axle hub. I press it down and making sure that everything is started right. As you can see, it pops into place, but make sure nothing gets bound up when you're doing this. Once it's down as far as you can go, put a little bit of pressure on it to make sure that it seats right into place. Once the bearings are pressed back onto the axle, I put them back into the housing and start the nuts by hand. I tighten them up in a crisscross fashion to ensure that the seal seats in correctly and does not bind. As you can tell from the brakes, there was plenty of grease leaking from this axle, but I did clean everything off before reassembling the brake system. When installing the wheel speed sensor, make sure that it's clean and then lube the O-ring on it to ensure that it doesn't tear it. Just slide it in place, and there's an 8mm bolt that holds it in place as well. I just use a 1/4" ratchet and just tighten it down by hand. And then the connector just slides on, and there's a red safety clip on it as well. Just make sure it is engaged after you have installed it. After installing the wheel speed sensor, clean the parking brakes and slide the clean rotor over them. I use a lug nut to hold the rotor in place and straight as I position the caliper and bracket assembly over it. You may need to expand the caliper to get it on, as they can close while performing the work on the axles. But once in place, I use blue thread locker on the bolts and start them by hand before I finish tightening them with a wrench. Once the axles and brakes are in, I climb under and apply a thin amount of silicone on the cover's mating surface and slowly position it in place, and use 2 bolts to hold it before starting the rest of the bolts by hand. Once all the bolts are started, I run them down with my impact driver before finishing them off with my wrench to ensure that they are tight. Then I wipe the excess silicone off with a rag and remove the fill plug. Once the plug is removed, I start to put the fluid in. The service data states that it calls for 4.75 pints of GL5 with 3.5 ounces of limited slip additive, and I used a hand pump to install it all as I was using a gallon container of diff fluid. But you fill it up until it starts to run out of the plug, then you install the plug, clean off any extra fluid, test drive and inspect for leaks. So I just got back from test drive. There's no leaks, no chatter or anything. So I just want to say thank you for watching, and click the like, subscribe, and notification bell, and have a good day.